You're under arrest for trespassing on private property." Those words from Delilah Pemberton cut through the night air like a blade. I stood on my cabin porch watching red and blue lights paint the pine trees in violent strokes. 2 patrol cars. A woman in designer activewear pointed at me like I was some criminal. Behind me, the lake reflected everything in dark, trembling mirrors. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, the place my father left me, the land our family had owned since 1962. Now I was being accused of squatting on my own property. If you're watching this from a small town where HOAs think they run everything, drop a comment. You'll want to hear how this ends. Sheriff Emmett Lawson stepped out of the lead vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The sound carried across the still water, amplified by the silence that had fallen over Lakeview Estates. He was a tall man, mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen enough drama to last a lifetime. "Sir, I need you to step down from the porch. We've received a complaint about your presence on this property." His voice was calm, almost apologetic, but it carried the weight of authority that made my chest tighten. Delilah stood behind him, flanked by 2 members of her HOA board. Even in the harsh glare of the police lights, she managed to look polished, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her activewear ensemble probably worth more than my monthly consulting fees. She had her phone out recording everything, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. "Sheriff, this man has been squatting here for weeks. He's refused every request to leave. He's violated our community rules, damaged our property values, and now he's threatening us. We have no choice but to involve law enforcement." And the way she said it, you'd think I'd been running a drug operation out of my family's cabin. I took a slow breath, feeling the familiar weight of the leather folder in my hand. 3 months of her escalating harassment, her threatening letters, her security guards shining flashlights through my windows at 2 a.m. 3 months of documenting every violation, every trespass, every attempt to intimidate me off land that had belonged to my family for over 6 decades. I'd known this night was coming. "Sheriff Lawson, my name is Callum Thorne. I'm a land management consultant, and this cabin has been in my family since 1962. I inherited it from my father 6 months ago." I held up the leather folder. "All documentation is here. Deed survey maps title every record confirming ownership." The sheriff glanced at the folder, then back at me, his expression shifting. Everything he needed was there, verified, certified, unbroken. He took his time while Delilah shifted from foot to foot behind him, her confidence beginning to crack. "This looks legitimate. These are county records. This deed is older than most buildings in this area." He turned to Delilah. "Mrs. Pemberton, have you actually verified your HOA's property boundaries against county records?" I mean, of course we have. The developers assured us that all the lakefront property was included. This cabin, it's been here so long we assumed it was abandoned, or that the owner would want to join the community." She trailed off, realizing how weak it sounded. The sheriff closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Mr. Thorne, based on what I'm seeing here, you appear to have legitimate ownership of this property. Mrs. Pemberton, I strongly suggest your HOA board consults with a real estate attorney before taking any further action. Making false reports to law enforcement is a serious matter." His tone had shifted cooler now, and I saw Delilah's carefully constructed authority crumbling in real time. "But Sheriff, he's violating our architectural standards. He hasn't paid HOA fees." Her voice was rising, losing control. "Ma'am, if he owns the property outright and it predates your HOA, then your architectural standards don't apply to him. That's a civil matter, not criminal, and based on what I'm seeing, you might want to consider whether your HOA has been harassing a legal property owner." The words hung in the air. Around us, I heard whispers from the neighbors. One older gentleman I'd seen kayaking was nodding slowly, arms crossed. The sheriff looked back at me. "Mr. Thorne, I still want you to come by the station tomorrow. Not because you're in trouble, but to document this properly. Bring all your paperwork. We'll make copies for our records just in case there are any future incidents." The way he said that last word with a pointed glance at Delilah made it clear whose incidents he was worried about. "I'll be there, Sheriff. And I also have documentation of harassment from the HOA. Security footage recordings, evidence of property damage. I'd like to file a formal complaint." Delilah made a strangled sound, but the sheriff just nodded. "Bring it all tomorrow." He turned to his partner. "We're done here. False alarm." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Delilah stood frozen on my driveway, her phone still clutched in her hand. The recording light was still on. She'd captured her own humiliation. "This isn't over. You don't belong here. This community will never accept you," she hissed as she turned to leave. The patrol cars pulled away, their lights fading into darkness. The neighbors dispersed, some casting curious glances my way. I stood alone in the sudden quiet and looked back at my cabin. The wooden sign my grandfather had carved, "Thorne Family since 1962, was illuminated by the porch light. It had weathered 6 decades of storms. It would weather this, too. I climbed the steps and went inside, finally allowing myself to feel the adrenaline crash. My hands were shaking slightly as I set the folder on the kitchen table. 3 months of preparation keeping my anger in check, while Delilah tried every trick to force me out. Tonight was just the first public confrontation. I knew something Delilah didn't. I knew exactly how far I could push back, exactly which laws protected me, exactly how to document everything she did wrong. 15 years as a land management consultant teaches you that. I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey and stood by the window overlooking the lake. The water was black glass reflecting stars. Somewhere across that water, Delilah was probably plotting her next move. Let her. Tomorrow I'll lay out everything at the sheriff's station. Every piece of evidence, every recorded conversation, every photograph, and then I'd wait. Because that's the thing about people like Delilah Pemberton. Give them enough rope, and they'll tie their own noose. 6 months earlier, I'd stood in a different kind of silence. The funeral home chapel was too warm, too full of flowers that smelled like they were trying to cover up something nobody wanted to acknowledge. My father, Duncan Thorne, lay in a casket that looked nothing like him wearing a suit he would have hated. He'd been a flannel and work boots kind of man, someone who believed land was meant to be lived on, not just owned. The pneumonia had taken him fast, 3 weeks from diagnosis to death, and I hadn't been ready. "You're never ready," people kept telling me. They were right. After the service, I'd met with Quentin Fairbanks in his cramped office that smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. Quentin had been my father's attorney for 30 years, a man who still used a fountain pen and kept files in actual cabinets instead of on computers. "Your father left everything to you, Callum," he'd said, sliding a folder across his desk. "The cabin, the land, all 15 acres. It's been in your family since 1962, when your grandfather bought it. Back then it was just wilderness and a dirt road." He'd paused, looking at me over his reading glasses. "Your father was very specific in his wishes. He wanted you to have it. He said you were the only one who understood what it meant." I'd opened the folder with hands that felt disconnected from my body, still numb from grief. Inside was the deed-thick paper with official seals and signatures going back decades. My grandfather's name faded but legible. My father's name added in 1989 when my grandfather passed. And now, space for mine. There were survey maps, too, showing the property boundaries with the precision that only county records could provide. 15 acres stretching along the lakefront, a perfect rectangle of land that had somehow remained untouched while everything around it changed. "There's something you should know," Quentin had said. "There's been development around the lake. A company bought up parcels and built what they're calling Lakeview Estates. Expensive homes, gated community, the works. But your land, your father made sure it stayed separate. He refused every offer they made." That's when I'd first heard about the HOA. "They've been persistent," Quentin had said carefully. "They want the entire lakefront under their control. Your father thought it was about property values and aesthetics. He told them no repeatedly. The developers knew about his land, they had to exclude it from their plans, but apparently the HOA leadership thinks they can convince the new owner to sell or join. You should be prepared for that conversation." I nodded, not really understanding what I was walking into. All I'd wanted was to go back to the cabin, to sit on the porch where my father and I used to fish, to feel close to him one more time. I hadn't realized I'd be walking into a war. The first time I'd returned to the cabin was in March, 8 weeks after the funeral. I'd driven up from Portland on a gray morning, the kind where the sky and the lake blend into one continuous sheet of steel. The highway turned into county roads, then into the winding lane that led to what I still thought of as my father's property. Except when I got there, everything had changed. Where there used to be an open shoreline and forest, there were now massive houses. 47 of them, according to the tasteful sign at the entrance. Lakeview Estates, a private lakeside community. And blocking the old access road, a security gate with a guardhouse. I'd pulled up to the gate confused. This wasn't the way to my father's cabin, but it was the only road. A guard stepped out, a young guy with a radio clipped to his belt, and the kind of bored expression that suggested this wasn't his dream job. "Can I help you, sir?" he'd asked. "I'm heading to my property," I'd said, pointing past the gate. "The Thorn cabin about a mile up on the left." He'd frowned and checked his tablet. "I don't have any Thorn on the resident list. This is a private community. If you're visiting someone, I'll need their name and unit number." I'd felt the first flicker of irritation. "I'm not visiting. I own property here. It's been in my family since 1962. The guard had looked skeptical but called someone on his radio. 5 minutes later, a silver Mercedes pulled up and a woman got out. That was my first meeting with Delilah Pemberton. She'd approach my truck with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, professional and cold. "Hello, I'm Delilah Pemberton, HOA President for Lakeview Estates. I understand there's some confusion. Everything about her screamed money and control, from her designer sunglasses to the way she carried herself, like she owned the entire lakefront." "No confusion," I'd said, keeping my voice level. "I inherited property here from my father, Duncan Thorne, the cabin and 15 acres. I'm just trying to get home." She'd glanced at the deed I held up, barely looking at it. "I see. Well, this is a private community now. All lakefront property is managed by our HOA. I'm sure you understand that old property claims can be complicated. Zoning changes, updates to county records, these things happen. Have you considered that your father's ownership might have been superseded?" The way she said it, so casual, so dismissive, made my jaw tight. "Mrs. Pemberton, my family's ownership is not complicated. It's documented, certified, and current. The deed is clear. I own 15 acres, and I'm going to my cabin." Her smile had frozen. "Mr. Thorne, I think you misunderstand how things work here. This is a managed community. We have rules about architecture, landscaping, noise levels, and property maintenance. If you're going to be staying here, you'll need to join the HOA, pay your membership fees, and comply with our community standards. Otherwise, we'll have to explore your options." Options. The word had hung between us like a threat. "What kind of options?" I'd asked. She'd shrugged, still smiling that cold smile. "Selling, perhaps? We have several residents who would love to expand their lakefront access. Or you could join the community and bring your property up to our standards. But you can't just exist here outside our structure. That's not how this works." I'd looked past her at the rows of identical expensive homes, at the manicured lawns, and the architectural uniformity that had swallowed the wild shoreline I remembered from childhood. This wasn't about rules or property values. This was about control, about someone who couldn't stand the idea of a piece of land she couldn't command. "Mrs. Pemberton," I'd said quietly, "I'm a land management consultant. I know property law. My family's ownership predates your HOA by 56 years. You have no authority over my land. Now I'm going to my cabin." I'd driven past the gate while she stood there, her smile finally gone, replaced by something harder. Looking back, that was the moment I should have known this wouldn't end with a polite conversation. The letter arrived 2 weeks after I'd moved into the cabin. I'd been settling in, repairing the small damages that 6 months of vacancy had created, reacquainting myself with the rhythms of the lake. Mornings were still cold in April, the water flat and silver under a weak sun. I'd wake up to the sound of loons calling across the water, make coffee on my father's old percolator, and sit on the porch watching the mist burn off. For those first 2 weeks, I'd almost convinced myself that Delilah's threats had been empty posturing. I should have known better. The envelope was expensive, the kind with a watermark and the HOA logo embossed in gold. Inside was a letter 3 pages long, itemizing 12 violations I'd supposedly committed. Violation 1, unapproved exterior paint color, the cabin's natural cedar finish did not meet community aesthetic standards. Violation 2, missing house numbers, all residences must display approved numerical signage. Violation 3, unauthorized dock repair. I'd replaced 3 rotted boards on my family's boat dock without submitting plans for architectural review. The list went on, each item more absurd than the last. At the bottom was a financial demand. $15,000 in back fees plus $500 per month going forward. Failure to comply would result in legal action. I'd sat at my kitchen table reading it twice, feeling my blood pressure rise with each ridiculous claim. The cabin had been this color since 1962. The dock had been maintained by my family for decades. None of this had anything to do with legitimate regulations. This was harassment, pure and simple. I picked up my phone and called the number at the bottom of the letterhead. A receptionist answered, told me Delilah was unavailable, and suggested I submit my concerns in writing. Tell her Callum Thorne called, I'd said. Tell her I know exactly what she's doing, and it won't work. The receptionist had been silent for a moment, then hung up. That's when I'd called Quentin. He'd listened to me read the entire letter, making small, thoughtful sounds at each violation. When I finished, he'd sighed. Callum, this is exactly what I was worried about. They're using bureaucracy as a weapon. The good news is you're right. None of this is legitimate. Your property predates their HOA, which means their regulations don't apply, but they're betting you don't want the hassle of fighting back. He'd paused. The question is, do you want to fight back, or do you want to consider their offer to buy you out? I'd looked out the window at the lake at the view my grandfather had purchased, my father had protected, and I had inherited. I'm not selling Quentin. This is my home. Then we fight, he'd said. But we fight smart. I'll draft a response. You start documenting everything. Every interaction, every letter, every violation they claim. And Callum, keep your temper. People like Delilah Pemberton want you to lose control. Don't give her that satisfaction. I'd promised I would, though even then I'd felt the anger simmering. 3 days later, I'd received a certified letter requiring my attendance at an HOA hearing. Attendance is mandatory, the letter said. Failure to appear will result in additional penalties. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse of Lakeview Estates, the building that had once been a forest where I'd built forts as a kid. I'd spent those 3 days doing exactly what Quentin suggested. I'd pulled every piece of documentation I had. The original deed from 1962, with my grandfather's signature, the transfer to my father in '89, the probate paperwork showing my inheritance. I'd driven to the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of everything paid for a current survey that showed my property boundaries with laser precision. I'd contacted the county surveyor and gotten written confirmation that my land was separate from the Lakeview Estates development. By the time Tuesday arrived, I had a folder 3 inches thick. The clubhouse was exactly what I'd expected. Marble floors, leather furniture, a chandelier that probably cost more than my truck. 45 people sat in rows of chairs facing a raised table where Delilah presided with 4 other board members. Everyone was dressed like they'd come from country club dinners. I was wearing jeans and a work shirt. I was making a point. Delilah's eyes had narrowed when I walked in, but she had maintained her professional smile. Mr. Thorne, thank you for joining us. Please take a seat. We'll call your case shortly. Case. Like I was on trial. I sat in the back row feeling the weight of curious stares. These were my neighbors, technically, though I'd never met any of them. They were here for the show to see the outsider put in his place. Delilah had called the meeting to order, worked through some routine business approving paint colors and landscaping plans, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she enjoyed the power. Then she called my name. Item 7 violation hearing for Mr. Callum Thorne property, located at what he claims is 512 Lakeview Drive. Mr. Thorne has failed to join our HOA, failed to pay required fees, and has accumulated multiple architectural and community standard violations. Mr. Thorne, would you like to address the board? I stood up carrying my folder to the front. Every eye in the room was on me. Yes, I would. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. First, I want to clarify something. I don't claim to own 512 Lakeview Drive. I do own it. I own 15 acres of lakefront property that includes what you've designated as 512 Lakeview Drive. I opened my folder and pulled out the deed. This property has been in my family since 1962. It predates this HOA by over 50 years. Second, I want to address your violations. I'd pulled out the county survey. This is a certified survey from the county dated 2 weeks ago. It shows clear property boundaries, my cabin, my dock, my land. All of it falls within property my family legally owns. The room had gone quiet. I'd walked up to the table and set the documents in front of Delilah. You'll also find here a letter from the county recorder confirming my ownership, a legal opinion from my attorney stating that your HOA has no jurisdiction over pre-existing properties, and a complete title history showing unbroken ownership from 1962 to present day. Delilah had stared at the documents, her face flushing. Mr. Thorne, these documents may show historical ownership, but that doesn't exempt you from current community standards. Everyone here has agreed to maintain certain aesthetic and behavioral expectations. Your refusal to comply affects all of us. Mrs. Pemberton, I'd said, keeping my voice level. I'm a land management consultant. I've worked with dozens of HOAs, property disputes, and boundary issues. I know the law. Your HOA was formed in 2018. My property was purchased in 1962. Basic property law states that you cannot retroactively apply HOA regulations to pre-existing property owners who never agreed to join your association. You have no legal standing to demand fees, impose architectural standards, or threaten penalties against me. The room had erupted in whispers. One man in the front row, older with white hair and weathered hands, had been nodding slowly. I'd see him later learn. His name was Silas. Learn he'd been a surveyor for 30 years and knew I was right. But Delilah had leaned back in her chair, her smile cold. Mr. Thorne, your interpretation of property law is interesting, but this board disagrees. We will be reviewing your documentation, and we will be consulting with our legal counsel. In the meantime, your violations remain on record. This hearing is concluded. She'd dismissed me like I was wasting her time. I'd gathered my documents and walked out feeling 45 pairs of eyes on my back. Outside, the night air had been cool and clean, a relief after the stuffy clubhouse. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking back at the building. Through the windows, I could see people talking, gesturing. Some were looking at Delilah with expressions that weren't entirely friendly. I'd driven home slowly past the rows of identical houses back to my cabin that stuck out like a wound in their perfect aesthetic. The lake had been dark, reflecting nothing but stars. I'd poured myself a drink and sat on the porch, my father's favorite chair creaking under my weight. Somewhere in the distance, I'd heard the low call of a loon. My hands had been shaking slightly, adrenaline finally catching up to me. I'd done everything right. I'd been calm, professional, armed with facts. But I'd also seen something in Delilah's eyes that worried me. She wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about property law or community standards. This was about pride, about control, about a woman who couldn't stand being told no. And that made her dangerous. The first week of May brought new tactics. It started small, almost subtle enough to dismiss as coincidence. A notice appeared on my door claiming I'd violated quiet hours, though I'd been asleep at the time it cited. Another letter warned me about improper waste disposal, though I'd taken my trash to the county facility like I always had. Each violation came with a fine, each fine added to the growing fictional debt they claimed I owed. I photographed every letter, noted every date and time, filed everything in expanding folders that were starting to take over my kitchen table. This was the beginning of what I recognized as a campaign systematic and deliberate. Week 2 brought the surveyors. I was working at my laptop reviewing a land assessment for a client in Washington when I heard trucks in my driveway. 3 men with equipment setting up a total station near my property line. I'd walked outside watching them work. The crew chief glanced up looking uncomfortable. "Morning, we're just doing some boundary verification for the HOA. I'd crossed my arms. Verification of what my boundaries are already on record with the county. He'd shifted his weight. Yeah, well, they want us to check for discrepancies between your claim and their property. I'd recognized what was happening immediately. This was pressure, an attempt to find some technical error they could exploit. You're using the wrong datum, I'd said, walking over to look at their setup. That's NAD 83. The original survey for this property was done in NAD 27. If you don't convert properly, you'll be off by several feet. The crew chief had blinked at me. How do you know that? I'd smiled without humor. I'm a land management consultant. This is what I do. He'd looked at his notes, then back at me. They told us to find discrepancies in your property line. Told us to be thorough. The way he said it, I knew they'd been instructed to manufacture problems where none existed. Let me save you some time, I'd said. My property boundaries are certified by the county. I have a survey from 3 weeks ago. You're not going to find discrepancies because there aren't any, but I'm going to document that you were here, who sent you, and what you were told to do. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The crew chief had held up his hands. Look, man, we're just doing a job. We don't want trouble. He'd packed up his equipment and left within 20 minutes. But I'd known the harassment wouldn't stop there. I'd been right. Week 3 brought the security patrols. Every night around 11 p.m., an HOA security vehicle would drive past my cabin, slowly shining a spotlight across my windows. The first night I'd thought it was a routine patrol. By the third night I'd realized it was intentional. The light would linger on my bedroom window, bright enough to wake me, then move on. I'd called the HOA office, left messages asking them to stop. No one called back. On the fifth night, I'd set up my security cameras, 4 of them covering every angle of my property, high-resolution motion activated with night vision. I'd position them to capture not just my land, but the property lines, the road, any vehicle that approached. By the end of the week, I had 12 separate recordings of the security vehicle harassment. The cameras caught more than I'd expected. On Tuesday at 2 a.m., the security guard didn't just shine his light. He got out of his vehicle, walked up to my porch, and took photographs of my cabin with his phone. He made notes on a clipboard circling my property, documenting everything. I watched the footage the next morning, feeling a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't about community safety. This was surveillance building a case, trying to find something, anything they could use against me. I'd downloaded the footage, backed it up in 3 locations, and added it to my growing file. Week 4 brought property damage. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as accidents. My mailbox was knocked over, bent at the base like someone had backed into it. I straightened it, noted the damage, and photographed it. 2 days later, my power went out. The HOA was doing road work nearby, they'd said, and had accidentally cut my line. It took 6 hours to restore. I documented it. Then my water line developed a leak right where the HOA had been working on their irrigation system. The repair crew not affiliated with the HOA had shaken his head. This pipe was cut, not broken. You can see the tool marks. I'd had him documented in writing and added his statement to my files. The dock was next. I'd gone down one morning to find my private property signs removed, thrown in the lake. The chain I'd used to secure my kayak had been cut. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Your property isn't safe. You're not safe. I'd retrieved the signs, bought a better lock, and added more cameras. That afternoon, I drove to the county sheriff's office and filed my first official complaint. The deputy who took my report had looked at my documentation, the timeline of harassment, the photographs and recordings, and had whistled low. This is systematic. You've got this organized better than most lawyers. I am organized, I'd said. I do this for a living. And I wanted on record that the HOA is harassing me, trespassing on my property, and damaging my belongings. The deputy nodded. I'll file this. Keep documenting everything. If it escalates, call us immediately. It was escalating. I could feel it. Then came the legal threat. A thick envelope from a law firm in the city, 3 hours away. Inside was a lawsuit civil complaint claiming I was a nuisance that had decreased property values for the entire Lakeview Estates community. They were suing me for $100,000 in damages. The claims were absurd. My cabin's appearance, they said, had reduced nearby home values by an estimated 5%. My refusal to join the HOA had created an unstable property situation that made buyers hesitant. My presence violated the peaceful enjoyment of their community. I'd sat on my porch reading the lawsuit twice, feeling the careful control I'd maintained starting to crack. $100,000. For having the audacity to live on land my family owned. I'd called Quentin immediately. They're using slap tactics, he'd said, his voice grim. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's not about winning, it's about burying you in legal fees until you give up and sell. The good news is we can fight this. The bad news is it's going to be expensive and time-consuming. We'd talked for an hour developing a strategy. Countersuit for harassment, restraining order to stop the security patrols, formal complaints to the county about HOA overreach. By the end of that conversation, I'd had a clear plan, but I'd also had something else, a comprehensive documentation of every violation the HOA had committed against me. 47 separate incidents over 4 weeks. Each one photographed, time-stamped, many of them recorded on video. I'd organized them by category: trespassing, harassment, property damage, intimidation. I'd created a timeline showing the escalation. I'd mapped them geographically, showing they were all concentrated on my property, proving this wasn't random. I'd built a case that any lawyer would envy. That night, I'd barely slept. I'd sat at my kitchen table with my files spread around me, checking every detail, making sure every piece of evidence was airtight. The cameras outside recorded the darkness, motion sensors ready to catch the next intrusion. And I'd known with absolute certainty that Delilah wasn't done. She was building something bigger. I just hadn't known yet how big. It happened on a Friday night in early June. I'd been working late finishing a forest management report for a client in Montana, my laptop screen the only light in the cabin, besides the soft glow from the kitchen. The lake was perfectly still outside my windows, dark as oil reflecting a quarter moon. It was almost 10 p.m. when I heard the vehicles. Not the usual single security patrol, but multiple engines' tires on gravel doors slamming. I'd looked up from my screen already knowing this was different. This was the confrontation I'd been preparing for. I'd walked to the window and seen 3 vehicles in my driveway. Delilah's silver Mercedes flanked by 2 SUVs belonging to board members I recognized from the hearing. She got out first wearing what looked like evening wear, like she'd interrupted a dinner party for this. 2 men followed her, both in their 50s, both carrying themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. One of them had a folder official looking, probably more fake violations. I'd taken a breath, grabbed the leather folder I kept ready by the door, and stepped onto my porch. The motion sensor lights flooded the driveway, and I saw Delilah's face flushed with anger or wine or both. "Mr. Thorne," she'd called sharp across the lake, "we need to speak with you immediately." I stayed on the porch folder in hand. "It's 10 p.m., Mrs. Pemberton. This can wait until morning." She stopped, eyes narrowing. "This is your final chance to comply." I shook my head. "You're on my property, Mrs. Pemberton. I follow every law that applies here." "That's where you're wrong," she'd said, pulling a document from the folder one of the men held. "This is an emergency order from the HOA board requiring you to vacate this property within 24 hours. You're trespassing on Lakeview Estates community land, and we're authorized to remove you." I'd felt a surge of anger, but I'd kept my voice level. "That document has no legal authority. You can't issue eviction orders on property you don't own." Her smile had been cold, triumphant. "We'll let the authorities decide that. If you won't leave voluntarily, we'll call the police. You're squatting on private property, and we're filing a formal complaint." That's when I'd realized this was her endgame. She had engineered this confrontation deliberately, planned it for a Friday night when she knew any legal response would be delayed until Monday. She wanted me arrested, wanted the spectacle, wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire community. "Go ahead and call," I'd said quietly. "I'll wait right here." The certainty in my voice had made her pause, but only for a moment. She'd pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and I'd watched her perform. "Yes, I need police assistance. We have a man refusing to leave private property. He's been trespassing for months, and we're concerned for our safety. The address is Lakeview Estates Lakefront property. Please hurry." She'd hung up and looked at me with satisfaction. "The sheriff will be here in minutes. I suggest you start packing." I'd stayed exactly where I was, folder in hand, and waited. The board members had shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. One of them had whispered something to Delilah, but she'd waved him off. "This is over tonight. Once he's removed, we can finally move forward with our plans for this property." Plans. She'd already decided what would happen after I was gone. Probably had a buyer lined up, someone who would pay a premium for prime lakefront access. The minutes had stretched out, uncomfortable and tense. Then the lights appeared, red and blue, painting the trees in familiar colors. 2 patrol cars this time, Sheriff Lawson stepping out of the first one. He'd taken in the scene, me on my porch, Delilah and her board members in my driveway, and I'd seen recognition in his face. He remembered the complaints I'd filed, the documentation I'd shown him. "Mrs. Pemberton," he'd said, his voice carrying that professional neutrality, "you called about a trespassing situation." She'd rushed forward immediately, words tumbling out. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. This man has been squatting on HOA property for months. We've tried everything to get him to leave peacefully, but he's refused. We have documentation that this entire lakefront belongs to Lakeview Estates, and he has no legal right to be here." The sheriff had glanced at me, and I'd held up the leather folder. "Sheriff Lawson, I'm Callum Thorne. We've spoken before. I have all my documentation right here." He'd nodded and turned back to Delilah. "Ma'am, let me see your documentation first." She'd handed him papers from her folder deeds for the Lakeview Estates properties, HOA bylaws, architectural standards, everything except what actually mattered. The sheriff had flipped through them quickly, his expression unchanging. "Mrs. Pemberton, these documents show your HOA's properties, but they don't show anything about Mr. Thorne's land." Her face had flushed darker. "His land is part of our lakefront? It has to be. We purchased the entire area. Did you verify that with county records?" the sheriff had asked. The question hung there, simple and devastating. The developers assured us, I reviewed the purchase documents myself. I'm a real estate attorney, I know what I'm doing." She'd been stammering, her confidence cracking. The sheriff had walked up to my porch, and I'd handed him the folder. He'd opened it under his flashlight, and I'd watched him go through each document. The deed shows ownership since 1962. The certified survey from 3 weeks ago, with clear boundaries. The title report shows an unbroken chain of custody. The letter from the county recorder confirming my property was separate from the Lakeview Estates development. The legal opinion from Quentin explaining in precise detail why the HOA had no jurisdiction. By the time neighbors started emerging from their houses drawn by the lights and voices, the sheriff was closing the folder. Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Thorne has legitimate ownership documentation. County certified legally sound. His property predates your HOA by over 50 years. I'd watched Delilah's face go pale. But that's impossible. The lakefront is ours. It has to be. The sheriff had handed me back the folder. Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing, Mr. Thorne owns approximately 15 acres of lakefront property. Your HOA development was built around his land, not on it. He's not trespassing. He's on his own property. The small crowd of neighbors had grown maybe 15 people now, standing in clusters on the road watching. I'd recognized some from the hearing. The older man who had been nodding the surveyor was there, arms crossed, watching Delilah with an expression that might have been pity. Sheriff, you don't understand, Delilah had insisted, her voice rising. He's violating our community standards. He won't join the HOA. He's ruining our property values. The sheriff had held up a hand. Mrs. Pemberton, those are civil matters, not criminal ones. And making a false report to emergency services is a serious offense. I could cite you for that right now. That's when I stepped down from the porch, walked to where the sheriff stood, and pulled out my phone. Sheriff, I'd also like to file a formal complaint. I have documentation of systematic harassment from this HOA. 47 separate incidents over the past 6 weeks, all recorded and time-stamped. I'd pulled up the video files, showed him clips of security vehicles shining lights through my windows, at 2 a.m. of people trespassing on my property, of damage to my mailbox and dock. I have statements from contractors about cutting utility lines. I have recordings of inappropriate surveyors admitting they were told to find discrepancies that don't exist. I have everything. The sheriff had watched several clips, his jaw tightening. He'd turned to Delilah, and his voice had gone cold. Mrs. Pemberton, I strongly suggest you and your board cease all contact with Mr. Thorne immediately. What I'm seeing here looks like a coordinated harassment campaign. That's actionable. Delilah had opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But he doesn't belong here. In this community we have standards, we have rules. She'd been falling apart in real time, and the neighbors were seeing it. One woman had pulled out her phone recording. This would be everywhere by morning. Ma'am, your standards don't apply to property you don't own. Mr. Thorne has every right to be here. You don't. The sheriff had gestured to his partner. We're done here. Mrs. Pemberton, I'm going to need you and your associates to leave Mr. Thorne's property immediately. As they had walked back to their vehicles, Delilah had turned to me one last time. Her face was twisted with something between rage and humiliation. This isn't over, she'd hissed quiet enough that maybe the sheriff didn't hear. You'll regret this. I just looked at her folder still in my hand, cameras recording everything. I think you're the one who's going to regret tonight, Mrs. Pemberton. The patrol cars had stayed until Delilah and the board members left, their taillights disappearing down the road. The neighbors had lingered longer, some approaching carefully, apologetically. We didn't know, one man had said, about your property, about what she was doing. I nodded, too tired to do more. The sheriff had given me his card. Come by the station Monday. Bring everything you've got. We'll document this properly. After everyone left, I stood alone in my driveway, listening to the lake lap against the shore. My hands were shaking with adrenaline. I'd won tonight, but I knew Delilah well enough by now to know she wouldn't stop. Not yet. Not until she'd exhausted every option. But I'd been ready for years for this exact kind of fight, and I had everything I needed to finish it. By Saturday morning, everyone knew. I'd woken to a text from Quentin with a screenshot of a neighborhood social media post, someone's breathless account of the police cars and the confrontation. The story had spread through Lakeview Estates like fire through dry grass. Some versions had me brandishing legal documents like weapons. Others claimed Delilah had been escorted away in handcuffs. None were quite accurate, but they all agreed on one thing: the HOA president had called the cops on a man who owned his property legally, and it had backfired spectacularly. I'd made coffee and sat on my porch, watching the lake come alive with morning light. My phone buzzed with an email. Someone had leaked the HOA group chat to me, pages of messages, confusion, anger, demands for answers. Why wasn't this property disclosed when we bought it? Did the board know about his ownership? How many other properties have unclear boundaries? Delilah had posted once at 3 a.m., saying the matter was being reviewed by legal counsel. The response had been immediate and hostile. By noon, 3 neighbors had knocked on my door. The first was a woman in her 40s, apologetic. "Mr. Thorne, I live 2 houses down. I just wanted to say I had no idea about your situation. What the board did last night wasn't okay." She'd handed me cookies homemade, still warm. The second visitor was a younger couple, both embarrassed. "We voted for Delilah last year. We didn't realize she was harassing you. We're sorry." The third visitor had been the older man from the hearing, the one who had been nodding when I'd presented my documentation. "I'm your neighbor 3 doors down. Retired surveyor, worked in this county for 30 years. I knew you were right that night at the hearing. Those boundaries you showed that survey work, it was perfect." We'd talked for an hour on my porch, 2 professionals discussing property lines and survey methods. He'd confirmed what I'd suspected. When Lakeview Estates was developed, the company had known about my family's land. "I saw the original development plans. Your property was marked clearly as excluded. Delilah would have seen those documents when she reviewed the purchase. She knew from day one." That confirmation had settled in my chest like a stone. This entire campaign of harassment had been deliberate, an attempt to force me out of property she'd always known was mine. Monday morning brought the emergency HOA meeting. I hadn't been invited, but Quentin had called. "You might want to attend this meeting. As an observer, I think things are about to shift." The clubhouse parking lot was packed when I arrived. I'd slipped in through the back, standing against the wall, while 40-plus residents filled the seats. Delilah sat at the head table, looking composed but tired. The vice president called the meeting to order, and immediately a woman in the 3rd row stood up. "I have a question for the board. Did you know about Mr. Thorne's property ownership when this HOA was formed?" The room went silent. Delilah had cleared her throat. "The board was aware that there was a pre-existing structure. We believed it would be absorbed into the community eventually." The woman hadn't sat down. "That's not what I asked. Did you know he owned that land legally?" Delilah's jaw had tightened. "The ownership was complicated. We acted in the best interest of the community." Another voice from the back. "By harassing him, by calling the cops and accusing him of trespassing on his own property." The meeting had devolved quickly. Voices overlapping, accusations flying, the carefully controlled environment Delilah had maintained crumbling in real time. Someone had demanded her resignation. Others had joined in. Then Quentin had stood up, and the room had quieted. "I'm Quentin Fairbanks, Mr. Thorne's attorney. I'm here to inform the board that we're filing a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, defamation, trespass, and intentional interference with property rights. We have documentation of 47 separate violations, and we're seeking damages as well as a permanent injunction." The room had erupted. Delilah's face had gone white. "You can't! We were acting within our authority." Her voice had been drowned out by chaos. The meeting ended with a vote. 39 members voted to remove Delilah as president, 6 voting to keep her. She'd gathered her things in silence, her hands shaking as she shoved papers into her bag. The county newspaper picked up the story 2 days later. HOA, President calls police on legal landowner. The article was factual, detailed, devastating. It quoted the sheriff, quoted residents, included copies of my deed. By Thursday, I'd received calls from 3 other consulting clients who'd seen the article, impressed by how I'd handled the situation. My professional reputation had actually been enhanced. The real shift happened in the community itself. A new board was elected. Their first action was to send me a formal letter apologizing for the harassment and confirming my property was recognized as independent. They'd proposed hiring me as a consultant to review the HOA's land management practices. I'd accepted, not because I needed the money, but because it was the right kind of closure. The lake that week had been unusually calm, mirror smooth every morning. The surveyor, whose name I'd learned was Silas, had become a regular visitor. "You handled that better than most would have," he'd said one morning. "Keep your head. Use the system." I shrugged. My father taught me that land is worth fighting for, but the fight has to be clean, legal. Across the water, I could see Delilah's house, a for sale sign already planted in the yard. She was leaving, selling at a loss, her reputation destroyed. I should have felt satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. This was never about winning. It was about protecting what was mine. 2 weeks after her removal, Delilah made her final mistake. She'd been quiet since the vote. Her house listed her Mercedes rarely seen around the neighborhood. I'd started to think maybe she'd accepted defeat, that the lawsuit Quentin had filed would proceed through normal channels without further drama. I should have known better. Desperation makes people reckless, and Delilah had lost everything: her position, her reputation, her standing in the legal community. She had nothing left to lose. The call came from the law firm that had sent the original $100,000 lawsuit. "Mr. Thorne, we're withdrawing as counsel for Mrs. Pemberton and the HOA. After reviewing the facts, we don't believe there's a viable case. What she did was indefensible. You have an excellent case for your countersuit." After he'd hung up, I'd sat staring at my phone. Even her own lawyers had abandoned her. She'd tried to find new representation. According to Silas, she'd contacted 4 different firms. None would take her case. Word had spread in the local legal community. The County Bar Association had opened an investigation into her conduct. She was being systemically dismantled, and she knew it. It was a Wednesday, 2 in the morning, when my security system alarm went off. I'd jerked awake, grabbing my phone, pulling up the camera feeds. Someone was on my property, moving near the dock. I'd watched the figure on the screen highlighted in the infrared of my night vision cameras, and even in the grainy footage I'd recognized her. Delilah was at my dock with bolt cutters working on the lock of my storage shed. I'd watched her for 30 seconds, documenting everything, then called the sheriff's office and Silas. "Someone's trespassing on my property. I have them on camera. Send someone immediately." Then I turned on every exterior light I had. The property flooded with brightness, and Delilah froze, caught. She dropped the bolt cutters and pulled out her phone, frantically photographing the inside of my shed, which contained nothing more interesting than life jackets and fishing equipment. She was manufacturing evidence, trying to find something, anything she could claim was a violation. I'd stepped onto my porch, my own phone recording. "Mrs. Pemberton, you're trespassing. The police are on their way." She'd spun toward me, and in the harsh light I'd seen her face, wild, desperate. "You've ruined everything," she'd shouted. "Everything I built here, my reputation, my career, all of it gone because you wouldn't just leave." I'd kept my voice calm, still recording. "I wouldn't leave my own property. You did this to yourself, Mrs. Pemberton." As she'd moved then toward one of my survey markers, the metal posts the county had placed to mark my boundaries, she'd grabbed it, trying to pull it up, to move it to alter the physical evidence of my property line. I'd watched in disbelief as she struggled with the marker, her hands bleeding. "Mrs. Pemberton, stop! You're making this worse." But she hadn't stopped. She'd wrenched the marker free and tried to reposition it 3 feet onto what she claimed was HOA land. That's when Silas arrived, pulled up in his truck, and simply stood there, watching. "Delilah, what are you doing?" he'd called out, his voice sad. She'd looked at him, at me, at the cameras she knew were recording everything, and something had broken in her expression. "He doesn't belong here. This community was supposed to be perfect, and She'd trailed off, holding the survey marker. When Sheriff Lawson arrived 5 minutes later, Silas and I had both been standing witness. The sheriff had taken one look at the scene, the bolt cutters, the damaged lock, the displaced survey marker in Delilah's hands, and his jaw had tightened. "Mrs. Pemberton, you're aware that tampering with survey markers is a felony in this state." She dropped the marker like it had burned her. I needed to verify he's lying about his boundaries." The sheriff had shaken his head. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." He'd been gentle but firm, guiding her toward his patrol car. As he had put her in the back seat, she'd looked at me one last time through the window, and I'd seen total defeat. This was her final desperate attempt, and it had only made everything worse. Silas stayed after the sheriff left, helping me document the damage photograph, the marker's displacement. "She's finished now. Tampering with survey markers, that's serious. She'll lose her law license for sure." I nodded, feeling no satisfaction. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to be left alone." Silas nodded. "I know, but some people can't stop. They push until they destroy themselves." We'd reset the survey marker together using a GPS unit to verify its correct position. The cameras had captured everything: crystal clear footage of Delilah's trespass, her attempted evidence tampering, her destruction of official survey equipment. It would all go to the prosecutor, to the Bar Association, to the civil court. The documentation was perfect, irrefutable, By sunrise, I'd backed up all the footage, sent copies to Quentin, to the sheriff, to my own secure servers. Delilah's last stand had been captured in high definition. Within 48 hours, the charges would be filed. Within a week, her law license would be suspended. Within a month, she'd be gone from Lakeview Estates entirely. The civil hearing was scheduled for mid-August, 8 weeks after that night with the patrol cars. The county courthouse was modest red brick with white columns. I'd arrived early with Quentin carrying 3 banker's boxes of documentation. Everything we'd collected over 4 months, organized with precision. This case was airtight. The courtroom was wood-paneled and formal. About 20 residents from Lakeview Estates had come to watch, including Silas in the front row. Delilah arrived with a lawyer I didn't recognize, a younger man who looked uncomfortable. Delilah looked diminished, thinner, her face pale without the confident smile that used to define her. Judge Beatrice Hargrove entered, steel-gray hair and sharp eyes. She'd built her reputation on property law cases. "Be seated. This is a civil hearing regarding property rights harassment claims and associated damages. Let's proceed." Quentin stood and began our presentation, laying out the timeline methodically. My inheritance, my legal ownership documented back to 1962. He'd shown the survey maps, county records, probate documents. Judge Hargrove examined each carefully. Then Quentin shifted to harassment. "Your Honor, what began as a property dispute became a systematic campaign of intimidation." He'd presented the HOA letters demanding $15,000 for violations that didn't apply. The defendant was fully aware of Mr. Thorne's legitimate ownership. We have email evidence from the original development company dated 2018, explicitly warning her that this property was excluded from the HOA purchase. The email appeared on the courtroom screen, proof she'd known from the beginning. Despite this knowledge, Mrs. Pemberton initiated a harassment campaign that lasted 4 months and included 47 documented incidents. Quentin presented the evidence. Security guards shining lights through my windows, 12 recordings. Damaged mailbox, cut utility lines, unauthorized surveyors. The false 911 call. Finally, Delilah trespassing and attempting to move survey markers, all captured on high-definition footage. Judge Hargrove watched several clips, her expression growing colder. "Counselor, does your client dispute the authenticity of any of this evidence?" Delilah's lawyer shook his head. "No, Your Honor." He'd argued that Delilah had acted in the community's interest, confused about boundaries under stress. It was weak. Judge Hargrove looked at Delilah. "Mrs. Pemberton, I've reviewed all the evidence and I'm deeply troubled. You're a licensed attorney with extensive real estate experience. You knew Mr. Thorne had legitimate property rights. Yet you initiated a harassment campaign that was illegal and unethical. You filed false complaints. You directed trespass. You called emergency services with false accusations. And when that failed, you personally trespassed and attempted to tamper with survey markers, a felony. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated effort to force a legal property owner off his land because you couldn't control it." The judge turned to her notes. "I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. Mrs. Pemberton, you are ordered to pay Mr. Thorne $85,000 in damages, $40,000 for emotional distress, $12,000 for property damage, $20,000 for harm to professional reputation, $13,000 in legal fees. Additionally, I'm issuing a permanent restraining order. You are not to come within 500 feet of Mr. Thorne's property or contact him." Judge Hargrove looked at the broader implications. The Lakeview Estates HOA is ordered to pay $25,000 in institutional damages. The HOA is permanently enjoined from taking any action related to Mr. Thorne's property. They must issue a formal public apology, hire an independent surveyor to verify all boundaries, and undergo 12 months of independent oversight. The judge turned back to Delilah. "I'm recommending that the State Bar investigate your conduct. The abuse of legal knowledge to harass a property owner is a serious ethical violation. You may face suspension or revocation of your license. Additionally, you are ordered to complete 200 hours of community service with an environmental conservation organization." The gavel came down sharp and final. "This hearing is concluded." Delilah's house was sold, she moved out, and her license was suspended. The HOA issued a public apology and brought me in as their consultant. Life returned to normal. I'd wake to loons, make coffee, and sit on my porch watching the lake. Silas stopped by twice a week. Other neighbors had warmed to me, waving as they passed in kayaks. One evening in late September, I sat on my dock watching the sunset. The light turned everything gold. I thought about my father, how he'd protected this land for decades. He'd taught me that land was worth defending, but that the defense had to be righteous. No shortcuts, no violence, no compromises with integrity, just documentation, patience, and faith in the system. I'd done it his way, and his way had worked. The wooden sign he'd carved Thorne Family since 1962 had been refinished and rehung. The cabin had received the maintenance it needed. It looked cared for, loved, which it was. Across the water, the houses of Lakeview Estates glowed with evening lights. They didn't look threatening anymore, just different. A different vision of lakefront living. My vision was older, quieter, rooted in family history. Both could exist. The key was respect for boundaries, for rights, for the law that protected both. I poured myself a whiskey my father's brand and raised the glass toward the setting sun. To Duncan Thorne, who'd taught me everything. To Quentin and Silas. To a system that, when given proper evidence, actually worked. The lake was mirror calm, reflecting the last light of day. And I was home, truly and legally, home on land that was mine to keep, to protect, and eventually to pass on. That's what victory looked like. Not revenge, not triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where you belonged.
From all of us here at QA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.